Another directive you're going to use is the @mixin. This is going to be able to create something called a mixin. And the idea behind mixins is to create repeatable sections of code. They're going to feel like functions in that they're going to be callable with or without parameters, but then take one or more rules, but then take one or more name value pairs and inject them into a rule. They can be parameterized, have defaults, and even have overloads. So what does this look like? The @mixin is going to define a mixin name, in this case font large, and that's going to have a variety of properties inside of the mixin. And then inside of a rule someplace, you're going to use @include and then the name of the mixin to inject this font section into the form. So that when you have a mix of properties, you can reuse injecting them into parts of your design fairly easily. In most cases, mixins are going to be parameterized. Here's an example of a mixin called rounded corners, where you're going to specify a size, and then it's going to use 3 name value pairs that help make the border radius work in all browsers. The border radius is an HTML5 convention, and the WebKit and Mozilla versions are for those specific browsers until everyone comes up to full HTML5 specifications. In this way, then, you can have in your design include rounded corners and then use a parameter to specify how rounded the corners could be. You can also specify a default value so that in most cases you can have a default size of, in this case, rounded corners, and then be able to, in the cases where you need to get around that, go ahead and supply the size variable to override that default value, much like in most programming languages. Let's see it in action. So let's go ahead and create a new mixin. And in the case of mixins, I typically, like we did earlier, I will create a mixin file, because often I'm using mixins in a variety of different CSS files. So I'll go ahead and import my mixins as well. And what do I want to do with the mixins? Let's look down here, and there's actually a couple of cases, like this border radius, that we can just refactor out. Let me copy that and go ahead and make a mixin. @mixin, and I'll call this rounded corners. In this case, I'll supply a variable called size. And let me paste those properties we had earlier, replace the 5s with the variable name. So if we go back to our regular file, we can take the radiuses we've included here, and we can just bring in our mixin by using the include rounded corners 5 pixels. If we save this and then look in the browser, we can see that it actually emitted those 3 lines for us. Now back in our Sass file, let's go ahead and find the other place or places we're using them. Like here in the contact form, we have it as well. So we're going to replace that with our reusable section. But here, let me go ahead and make the size larger. And when we do this, look at it in the browser, we can see that it did emit the border radiuses, but it made it those 15 pixels. So on our form, we can now see that we have the small 5 pixel rounding here, and then the much larger 15 pixel rounding here. Again, we're using that reusable place so that we can inject all of the different browser versions of the rounded corners, but it just works. But it may be that we want to say that the size of our rounded corners is pretty standard by saying colon and then the default size we want to give to rounded corners. And in that way, back in our Sass file, in most cases we can just go ahead and say include rounded corners and not even give it the whole parentheses, or we could give it empty parentheses. And this will make it 5 pixels anywhere it's not specifically defined. See, the 15 is still showing up here in contact form because that's where we've actually defined 15. But up here, it's defaulting to that 5 pixels for us. And this way you can make a variety of these mixins that you can use in a pretty seamless way. This becomes a fairly common case to do things like shims and polyfills. So that if you have, a way in IE9 and IE10 or even IE6 or 7 to do the same rounded corners, you don't have to pollute every place you're going to add that workaround into your file here. You can isolate them into these mixins and then just add the different properties to that mixin. Great, let's head back to the slide. Another directive that's important is at function. Now, mixins allow you to inject name value pairs directly into rules. Functions allows you to create standard code that's going to be used for functional representations. So here is an example of us defining an app width and then a function called column width that's going to calculate the size of columns based on the number of columns. So here we can see we can define a class called column2 for double columns that will then calculate our column width. And we can do the same with column 3. And this is a fairly common way to be able to calculate it. The reason you want to use a calculation here and not just fix it, because you may only be using it once, is later if you decide that your app width is 1000, 1024, or something larger or smaller, you want it to be able to adapt to that change without having to go and do the fix-ups of all the pixel by pixel math yourself. Let's see it working. So let's go ahead and create a quick function. First, I'm going to create a variable for the size of our app, which I'm going to say is going to be 1024 pixels. And then I can go ahead and create a new function called center width. Now let's specify a gutter width that we're going to use to calculate how wide to make a specific element. Basically, we're going to calculate based on the app size and the gutter size how wide to make something. And we're going to use this later on down here in our container. Instead of saying width 800, we're going to say center width, and let's say we want 100 pixels on each side. We're just going to say at return, app size, minus gutter times 2. And if we did this right, we'll see that our width is now 824 instead of 800. That's because we've taken that standard function of saying we want 100 on either side, taken the 1024 minus 200 is giving us that 824. And so this is going to allow us to create unique functions that we're going to use in making our design adapt to parameters of the design. Great, let's go back to the slides. Our last topic is going to be control directives. And these are additional directives that can be used to really change the flow of your application. Let me give you some examples. At if is one that will allow you to, based on some calculation, determine whether something's included or not included. For is going to allow you to do looping. Each is also going to allow you to do a different sort of looping, and then finally while to do a looping based on a test. Let's see each of these. So in the case of if, we can have a rule like in this case in H1 that says if some variable size is greater than, in this case, 14 pixels, go ahead and make it the color blue. We can also have else ifs. If the size is less than 14, make it red, and then if it's exactly 14, go ahead and default it out to green. It's going to allow you to specify what things are going to be included in the rule. Notice that this is saying color equals blue. It's not calculating a value. It's really just placing what is going to be inside this H1. For is going to allow you to do a variable-based loop. In this case, it's defining a new variable called call for column, and it's going to walk through this loop 4 times from 1 through 4, specifying that the value of call is that. And this way we can say call and then use the string interpolation we looked at earlier to say call, and then in this case, the first time it will be 1, and then 2, 3, and 4, to calculate the width based on the page width divided by that column. And so this is a common way to be able to build the multi-column formats, is to be able to, if your design requires both the 1 column, 2, 3, and 4, you can really do this in a pretty simple way of building those up programmatically instead of just having them fixed. Now for 1 to 4, you might not go through all this trouble, but for 1 to 14 or 1 to 90, you certainly would. Now each and while are both similar in for in that they're looping mechanisms. Each is going to take a list of items, in this case just some strings, and then walk through each of those, assigning them to item. And here's an example where it's using that string interpolation to say, create a class for each one of these, and then set the background URL based on the name in some way. Here I'm pulling the images of first.jpg, second.jpg, etc. And while works in a similar way of the for as well, except you're testing for some value. Here I have a 1, and as long as the I variable is less than 5, it's going to continue running through this. So I can, again, use string interpolation to build up the H1, 2, 3, 4s, and 5s based on some calculation. But in this case, it's not going to automatically change the value of I. I might have even an if statement here that says if some value is here, whether to increment or not increment the I value. All 4 of these are bringing in programming ideas into CSS, but remember, this is about generating a fixed CSS file. It's not about runtime execution of this CSS whatsoever. You're not going to be able to take variables from a running JavaScript and then send them to the server and then regenerate this at runtime. This is more about being able to be more efficient about creating more complex CSS. Let's see a couple of examples. So let's use the for loop to just create something like those column values we saw in our example. So I'm going to say for, and then create a variable name. I'll call this my column number from 1 through, actually I'll just say from 2 through 5. Then I'm going to walk through and execute this 4 times, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'm going to create a new class for each one of these called column dash and then the number. And I'm going to use that string interpolation to put my column number directly in here. So this is going to create a new rule for a class called column -2, -3, -4, and then -5 on each execution. We'll see this in a minute. And now all I'm going to do is set the width based on the app size, to make sure that's the right name, app size, yep, divided by the column number. So in this case, we're going to define a class that will be half the size of the column number for 2, and then 1/5 of the app size for 5. And let's go ahead and include a little buffer region. So let's take 10 pixels off of whatever that size is. So we have some room actually to stack these columns together. So let's see this in the browser. We'll see that this created column 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then calculated these based on that formula we put in. So that if we come up here and change this, and let's go back to our 900 size of our app, it's then going to calculate these based on 900 as well. And so it creates a pretty easy way to create these flow sections that are important to what we want to do without having to manually do a lot of complicated math every time, or without having to embed those formulas over and over and over again. Great, let's head back to the slide. So let's wrap up what we've learned. The goal here is to make better CSS and stay sassy, as I like to say. Sass is going to allow you to take the skills you have as a developer and apply them to CSS creation. Sass will also improve reuse, readability, as well as maintenance. The idea is to take things like magic strings out of the equation, to define colors only once so that you're not repeating them, and also to be able to use things like nested rules to be able to see better what CSS you're actually emitting, what the CSS actually means, and how different rules are related to each other. By using things like the import, mixins, and functions, you can modularize your designs better, imply a lot of structure to what you're doing so that you can have parts of the design in separate files, even though for performance, you're emitting them as one large CSS file ultimately when you deliver this to the browser for your users. By supporting things like control flow, templating, and more, you can really improve the styling you're building and also make it more adaptive to change instead of having to trust that the CSS you bring in or that you're using will work and then dive down and hopefully find the offending line of code that is acting differently in a different browser. This should give you a better sense of what the CSS is actually doing for you and allow developers to be closer to their designs instead of treating the CSS as a black box. This has been Sean Wildermuth of Agilitrain. Thanks a lot.